The cycle of capital has three stages. First, through the conversion of capital into money, the owner of capital, which is a social relation of production, value in motion, buys the means of production and labor power. In the second stage of the cycle of capital, the proletariat, the worker, objectifies his labor power, which is his life, in his working hours, because time is the magnitude of value, and value differentiated from use value and exchange value in capital is undifferentiated human labor. So in the second stage of capital, the proletariat produces a commodity whose value exceeds the capital originally invested by the owner of capital, by the capitalist. And the way in which a commodity that exceeds the value originally invested by the owner of capital is produced is through what Marx calls surplus value. Surplus value means that the totality of value produced during the labor time of a worker, in which human life is materialized in the production of a given commodity, is not returned in its totality in the salary which the producer receives. The difference between the total value of the commodity produced and the salary which the proletariat obtains is excess value, which is not paid and is accumulated illegitimately in the form of private property. In the third stage of capital takes place the transformation of value into price in a market regulated by the competition between capitals, whereby the technologically more developed capitals extract what is known as extraordinary surplus value, profit, from the technologically less developed capitals, and the surplus value produced by the proletariat and not returned in the salary is distributed from the industrial capital to the merchandise capital to the financial capital. The contradiction between capital as a social relation of production, as the result of collective labor owned by the bourgeoisie, expresses itself in the production of surplus value, the totality of labor objectified in the given time of production of a specific commodity is not fully returned in the salary, and that excedent value which is not paid, which is not returned, is therefore stolen, because that surplus value, when the commodity is commercialized and its value is converted into price in a market regulated by competition between capitals, that profit goes into the private property of the owner of capital. And by examining the cycle of capital and the process of production of capital itself, where the surplus value is generated, and Marx distinguishes between absolute surplus value, which implies increasing the time of production in order to increase what Marx calls the time of surplus work, whereby surplus value is generated. By analyzing relative surplus value, whereby the magnitude of salary is reduced in proportion to the price, which is value transformed and fixed due to the competition of capitals in the market, by analyzing the contradiction between capital and labor, the centralized control over the means of production, and the negative social consequences of that illegitimate appropriation of social labor, we have the basis for a critique of the concrete contradictions which are imminent to the capitalist mode of production. If we add the destructive application of science and technology, the destructive application of the massive development of the forces of production, of the means of production, and of capital, of social wealth, which in capitalism is employed first of all for the purpose of the war industry to produce weapons of mass destruction which are ever more destructive, capable of wiping out not only humanity but most of the complex life forms on the surface of the planet, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, which are the result of the application of specific branches of science, physics, chemistry, biology. Chemistry is being used for the purposes of war since the First World War with Fritz Haber, and this destructive application of science and technology for the purposes of the war industry is nothing but the expression of the consequences of the centralized control over the means of production, the centralized control over the massive development of the forces of production and of science as a means of production, which Horkheimer from the first generation of the School of Frankfurt identifies as science being a means of production. The accelerated consumption of non-renewable forms of energy, the destruction of the environment, the precipitated acceleration of global warming, more drastic forms of poverty, the difference between the rich and the poor increases so that the 10 wealthiest, richest people in the world accumulate as much capital as more than half of humanity. The fact that through the neo-colonial dynamics of the world market, the technologically more developed capitals of the first world extract extraordinary surplus value from the technologically less developed capitals of the third world, therefore developing the economies in the first world at the cost of increasing the exploitation and causing the underdevelopment of the proletariat, of the peasants and of the working majorities and wage slaves of the third world, Latin America, Africa, Asia. The periodic tendency of capitalism to reach crises of superproduction, where capital, a social relation of production, value in motion, is paralyzed, and something similar to what happens during a heart attack takes place during a crisis of superproduction, insofar as capital as value which is circulating suddenly stops. And just like when blood stops flowing, a heart attack takes place. Well, when capital as value in motion ceases to circulate, capitalism enters a crisis of superproduction. Taking into account the forms of exploitation that take place with the extraction of absolute and relative surplus value, extraction in the sense that the proletariat produces an excess value which is not paid in the salary by the owner of the capital, and which the owner of the capital therefore accumulates in the form of private property. The increasing contradiction between the centralized nature of the capitalist system, where the wealth, social, production, resources are ever more centralized, and the bigger social nature of a system which has permeated every corner of the world, the destructive application of science and technology for the war industry, for an industry and technology based on programmed obsolescence, an industry based on the unsustainable consumption of non-renewable forms of energy and resources, the war industry which needs to cause conflict in order to keep the production of weapons going as a perfect way to revitalize economy and avoid a crisis of superproduction, the neo-colonial exploitation of the third world. All of these elements make it crucial to return to Marxist theory of value, to return to the political praxis of Marxism, which has the objective of radically transforming the capitalist mode of production. Because if the capitalist mode of production is not radically transformed, its inherent contradictions are not abolished, from absolute and relative surplus value to alienated work, to the contradiction between capital and labor, to the neo-colonial exploitation in the world market, to the destructive application of science and technology, we will end up destroying ourselves. It is no longer about just the exploitation of the working majorities, of the wage slaves, of the proletariats around the world, but now, together with that unceasing exploitation, we are facing environmental issues, we are facing the threat of extinction due to the accumulation of weapons of mass destruction, and due to the perpetuation of a technology which is destroying nature, which is destroying the environment. So in order to have a future as a species and to avoid our planet becoming a wasteland like Mars, we have to take action. And consciousness, social consciousness, has to be unified. The political agenda has to recognize that the political contradictions which Foucault describes, which Agamben describes, which various philosophers have noted in capitalism, derive from the contradictions of the economic system. The merchandise fetishism, which implies that the true social relations of capital, the antithesis between value and use value contained within a commodity which is externalized in the form of the relative form of value, which implies the exchange between two commodities, and then to a explicated form of relative value, which then moves on to the general form of value, and then to the money form of value, where money takes the form of a general equivalent. and the commodity which assumes the relative form of value projects its value in money, hiding the true nature of the profit gain in capitalism, which is human labor not paid in salary, hiding the exploitation in the world market, hiding the true nature of a system that is based in the exploitation of the majorities and in the production of commodities which do not satisfy the needs of the majorities. Marxism is today more important than ever before because we are in a crucial moment in history. What we do now will define the future of life in this planet.